So welcome and thank you for coming to hear a little bit about foundational reading skills in a multi-tiered system. So in case you're not familiar with UFLI, that stands for the University of Florida Literacy Institute. And we think of our work as residing at the intersection of teacher development and reader development. We mostly help kids by helping their teachers become more effective. We also do some work directly with kids. In our pre-service teacher ed program, we do a lot of tutoring. And anyway, let's just get started. Our agenda for today, in talking about foundational reading skills within a multi-tiered system, I thought it would be helpful to start with a little bit about multi-tiered systems through that foundational reading skills lens. So we'll talk a little bit about effective assessment practices and effective instruction intervention, but really more from a principles kind of stance. And then we'll spend a little bit more time talking about the road to fluent reading, so developing children's understanding of sounds and letters and the combinations, their grapheme phoneme correspondences, getting right into words, reading text, and then if we have time, because I do tend to go on and on and on, I also included a little bit about supporting efficient practice, because practice is going to be a theme you'll hear me talk about a lot today, how important practice is. So let's get started. I will be referring to the UFLI toolbox, so if you haven't visited the toolbox, you will want to. And at the end of the session, I have a QR code that has a little digital handout that you can go to that has links to this and a lot of other resources that I will be mentioning. So the UFLI toolbox has tons of resources and they're all free. So please do take advantage of that fact. I imagine that probably everybody in this room is familiar with the concept of the simple view of reading. But in case you're not, the simple view of reading can be summed up in one sentence, and that is that reading comprehension is the product of decoding and linguistic comprehension. So this idea is that for reading comprehension to be intact, you have to have both good decoding skills and good language skills. And if either one is weak, reading comprehension will be weak. If both are weak, reading comprehension will be even weaker. So just as a heads up, we're going to be focusing just on the decoding side of the simple view. This is in no way saying that decoding is more important. They're both literally equally important in this equation. But we don't have all day, so we're going to talk about decoding specifically. And then if you're familiar with, not already. Okay, there we go. If you're familiar with Scarborough's rope, we're going to be talking about the word recognition pieces, the word recognition strands of the rope. So when we're talking about a multi-tiered system of support, and again, I imagine this is not news to you all, we know that Tier 1 core instruction is what everyone should get. We know that Tier 1 will not be sufficient for everyone. Some will need more than that. So some kids will need some supplemental or Tier 2, and some children, hopefully just a few, will need Tier 3. So one of the things that's really important in this process is assessment to determine where kids fall in that scheme of things. So just a little bit about what we're talking about when it comes to foundational reading skills, what the purposes of assessment are. So we can think of a variety of purposes. So one is screening, and I like to think of screening as kind of like panning for gold, right? You have a pan with a screen as the bottom, and the water and the sand go through that, but you're left with little nuggets of gold. Those little nuggets of gold are the kids who are most likely to struggle, and the screener tells us that. So when we're using a screening assessment, we're looking for those little nuggets to know who to focus our efforts on. When we look a little bit closer at those nuggets to find out the nature of their needs, that's what we refer to as diagnostic assessment. That tells us what specifically they need help with. And then for progress monitoring, everybody needs to get this. So this idea is kind of like just going for your annual checkup, where you're just, your doctor is measuring to see if you're growing like you should. That's what those progress monitoring checks are for. And then, of course, we also have outcome measures, right? These are those high stakes assessments that really have very little to do with what we do in the classroom. When we're thinking about screening in particular, we're thinking about the idea that this will give us a general idea of who's likely to do how on the progress monitoring. So we may have some kids that look like they're right on benchmark and we don't need to worry about them. We may have some kids even above that. Then we have some kids who are at some risk, and hopefully we just have a few kids at most who are at high risk. And when it comes to using that information and getting into diagnosis, we need to be sure to do diagnostic assessment with those kids who are at significant risk, for sure. We should also do diagnostic assessment with the kids who are at some risk. We don't need to do diagnostic assessment with everybody. That would really be a waste of our instructional time. It's not essential. And I hear teachers all the time, I gave my whole class this diagnostic assessment. Ooh, I wish you had spent that time teaching them instead of doing all of that additional assessment. So we need to be judicious about who we're spending that effort on and what we're doing with them. So for foundational reading skills, when we're talking about diagnostic assessments, we're thinking about things like the core phonics survey is a good one. The quick phonics screener is a good one. There are a lot of good screeners or diagnostic assessments that'll help us kind of pinpoint which foundational skills kids are struggling with, which ones they've already mastered. So the way that I think about this is through kind of a flow chart or a hierarchy of assessment. When I give that initial screener, I'm doing something, usually an assessment of text level automaticity, also known as oral reading fluency. And that'll give me a lot of information right there. If text level automaticity is strong, but I know my child's struggling in reading, that means that the problem is probably on the language side of that simple view equation. So I probably don't need to worry more about decoding. If they've got good oral reading fluency, that means they've got the capacity to read text accurately and automatically. If text level automaticity is weak, I'm going to go a little bit further down, dig a little deeper, and assess word level automaticity. So can kids not just read words, but can they read words automatically without having to stop and labor through the words? If that's strong, but they're struggling, and they were weak in text level automaticity, I'm going to do my intervention at that text level. Just work on reading fluency. If word level automaticity is weak, I'm going to dig deeper. And I'm going to look at decoding accuracy. Can the children decode the words correctly? If that's strong, that means word level automaticity is where I'm going to focus my efforts. If that's weak, I'm going to dig deeper still and look at their phonemic awareness. If their phonemic awareness is strong, I'm going to, you get the idea, you see this pattern? And really phonemic awareness is as deep as I'm going to go when it comes to foundational reading skills. If that's weak, then my intervention needs to include some phonemic awareness. But the important thing here is that the goal is we want to keep digging until we find where the source of the problem is. So this particular flowchart is one of the resources that will be linked in the digital handout that I mentioned earlier. So we talked about who to diagnose, who to progress monitor. Well, everybody needs that well check, right? When you go to the doctor to see if you're growing, we go to the teacher to see if our reading is growing. And again, when we're talking about progress monitoring assessment, we can look at it at kind of different levels. I think of the basic progress monitoring that we do across the year, a beginning, middle, and end of year, is are my students meeting benchmarks? How do they look compared to the norms expected of their grade level? And those are just usually maybe 3 or 4 times a year. But I'm also really interested in, did my students learn what I just taught them? Did they get it? That's going to be a different kind of progress monitoring, and it's going to need to be a lot more frequent because you're teaching them a lot of different things. You can do some of that through just teacher observation during class, listening to their responses. When they hold up their whiteboard to show you something they wrote, is it correct? You can scan and get a lot of really good information really quickly, and that's really helpful. But we don't want to rely just on our observation because we may be missing things. We may not notice the child who's over there quietly struggling. So we want to do more frequent assessment of the skills that we're teaching. And so this is something that I like to see teachers do as often as weekly, just quick measures to see, are they doing what I wanted them to be able to do? And so I actually really like for foundational reading skills to administer an encoding assessment. So encoding or spelling is a really good indicator of both encoding skills and decoding skills. It's really rare for a child to be able to spell a word that they can't also read. It's very, very rare. It's quite common for a child to be able to read a word that they can't also spell. So if you're administering an assessment of encoding or spelling, you're kind of getting both, kind of killing two birds with one stone. You can also do an assessment of decoding, but the other advantage of doing a spelling assessment is it can be group administered. So it can literally take 5 to 10 minutes to assess your whole class. Whereas if you're pulling kids up individually to do decoding assessment, it's going to be a whole lot longer. There's a whole bunch of chairs over here. You don't have to sit on the floor. Come on up. Don't be shy. So frequent assessment is really more monitoring of progress. How are they actually doing? So that's a little different than are they meeting benchmarks? So outcome measure, you also want to do with everybody, but I'm not going to talk about that. One of the issues with our multi-tiered systems is we have our goal and then we have reality in a lot of schools. Have you guys seen these numbers happen, the upside down? Yeah. Sure.
Going back to your last slide, so what is how do I say this? I have several students who are starting to read well, so they're decoding well, but then can't spell those same words that they can read. So how do you explain that?
It tells, the question was for the video. If you're wondering, why is she repeating? We heard that. The question was, we have kids who can decode words well, but they are struggling to spell them. It tells me they don't really have those concepts completely mastered yet, and they still need more practice with using those grapheme phoneme correspondences that you're assessing. So yeah, it just tells you that you need to keep going with that instruction. And if you're doing practice that keeps coming back and practicing over time, most kids are going to get it eventually. They just may need more practice with it. And we're going to actually talk about that when we get into effective instruction and intervention as well. Okay, so I get a lot of nods that this is something you commonly see. So that's a problem, right? And we need to be thinking about that because generally what that means is that the tier 1 is a problem. The tier 1 isn't meeting enough kids' needs. And so in any multi-tiered system, whether it's foundational reading skills or math or anything else, you've got to make sure that your tier 1 is effective and efficient at meeting kids' needs. And if it's not, change tier 1, don't keep adding on interventions. We don't have the human resources to provide all of that intervention, and it's just not going to be as effective. And kids have to fail a lot in that kind of system where we don't provide strong tier 1. So effective tier 1 is intended to meet the needs of at least 80% of your kids. And in reality, that's not a very common thing that we see. We see more often more kids needing intervention than not, and that's a problem. So If you don't know Michelle Elia, you should, because she's wonderful, but this is a quote from her that I just love, that you can't intervene your way out of a tier 1 problem. You gotta fix tier 1. So I know a lot of the folks here, you all are invested in providing effective intervention, but I'm hoping that you're also invested in making sure that whatever is happening before kids need that is really solid. So we've got to have strong tier 1. So let's talk about what strong tier 1 looks like. Well, one of the things that I think is important is just to understand some basic principles of effective instruction. Again, these are principles that apply especially to foundational reading skills, but they apply elsewhere as well. When I think of effective instruction, I'm thinking about it being explicit. And by explicit, I mean clear, direct, lots of participation from students, lots of success from students. Okay, instruction that's unambiguous. Kids know exactly what it is I want them to learn. That's explicit. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a model of what that might look like in the context of foundational reading skills. So this is the introduction to the consonant digraph SH. You're wondering, why is there a CK up there? Well, because part of explicit instruction is that we connect it to prior knowledge. So a consonant digraph is two consonants that come together to make one sound. You've already learned about a consonant digraph. You've learned about CK. When C and K are together at the end of a word, they make one sound, k, like at the end of duck. The two consonants, S and H, each have their own sounds, S and H. But when these two consonants come together, they make a new sound, sh, like at the beginning of the word sheep. The consonant digraph, SH, can come at the beginning of a word like ship or shop. The consonant digraph, SH, can also come at the end of a word like fish or wish. Okay, so that's just a very basic introduction, and I'm not going to stop there. I'm going to keep explaining what I need to know about SH. I'm going to talk about what's happening in your mouth when you're making the sound. To make the SH, the sh sound, put your teeth together and round your lips like this. Shh. Pull your tongue back toward the back of your mouth. Be sure your voice is off. So we already know what voice on and off means. It means your throat is not vibrating. Can you do this? Shh. Be sure your voice is off because this is a quiet sound. Shh. The sh sound is a continuous sound that can be stretched out. Shh. Watch me. Shh. Now you try. Shh. Good. So at this point, we would then add the grapheme card, SH, to our phoneme card that represents the production of shh. We would then practice some letter formation. If the kids need it, by the time they get to digraphs, they probably don't need a lot of letter formation practice anymore, but if they do, we'll practice writing the S, we'll practice writing the H, then we'll practice writing the SH together. We like these little GIFs. These are all available on the toolbox for free, that kids have a model of what the letter should look like. That way, the teacher can walk around and watch to make sure that kids are forming correctly and that their practice is correct. Once they've practiced letter formation, okay, they've now heard SH, they've practiced pronouncing it, they've seen it, they've learned about where it fits in a word. Now we're going to actually practice reading and spelling words that have that. So first, it's going to be I do, watch me read, shed, shed. Okay, we're going to now read some together. Ready? Shop, shop. Shut. Okay, you get the idea, right? So we're going to practice a bunch of words that have the SH at the beginning, at the end. We're going to practice some longer ones, a little bit more complicated. They get harder as we go. So we're going to practice reading a bunch of words. And then we're going to practice spelling. So I would, again, do an I do. I would spell ship sh, ip. How many sounds? Okay, the first one is sh. Sh is sh. That's that sound I just learned. I would write sh, sh, write the ip, write the p, read the word, and then we would also then spell together. So everybody would pull out their paper or their whiteboards and spell along with me. So that's an explicit introduction to SH. We can think of it as explanation and demonstration, guided practice, independent practice, and then we're going to keep practicing over several days. They're going to keep encountering that SH representing the sh sound. So effective instruction is explicit. Effective instruction is also systematic. So when I'm talking about systematic, I'm talking about having a plan that makes sense, and following that plan. The best example that I can come up with is a blueprint. Okay? A builder would never just show up on a vacant lot to build a house and start nailing boards together. They have a plan, and that plan needs to be executed by following steps in a specific sequence. The sequence matters. Now, the sequence doesn't matter for everything, right? You've got to have a strong foundation before you can put walls on. You've got to have walls before you can put a roof on. But who cares if you put in this window before that door, right? There's some things that can be moved around, but there's some things that really need to be in a particular sequence. And when we're talking about reading, we're talking about using a scope and sequence that has things planned out in a sequence that makes sense. So effective instruction is explicit, and effective instruction is systematic. The other thing that I think is probably the most important of all in all of this is that effective instruction includes ample opportunities to respond. Okay? Opportunities to respond, the most important thing. So when we're talking about opportunities to respond, this is anything that you say, any teacher request or question or comment that prompts students to respond or to practice whatever it is you're teaching them. So I think of it as practice, 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 right? Where we know that some kids with just a few exposures to a word or to a new grapheme phoneme correspondence, they're going to get it. Other kids are going to need a ton more. And the only way that we're going to make sure that all kids' needs are met is to provide all kids with a lot of practice. Some kids then, based on our progress monitoring assessment, may need even more practice, right? But we need to make sure that everybody is getting enough practice to be successful. So just to give you a sense of what that might look like in a foundational skills lesson, I might say repeat this sound. What sound does this letter spell? Read this word, spell this word. Anytime I say do this and you do it, that was an opportunity to respond, and that's practice on your end. Now, we know that frequent responses mean that instruction is truly interactive. And if instruction is truly interactive, that means learning and attention and on-task behaviors all go up. It also means that behavior difficulties go down. One of the things that we see a lot, we hear all the time, because our pre-service teachers learn how to use UFly Foundations in their program, and our local district was our pilot district. So they've been doing UFly Foundations now, they're in their third year implementing it. So the teachers, our teacher candidates go out and they get to actually practice it. But they tell us over and over again that their mentor teachers suggest you should get your formal observation done during a UFly lesson because it's the time of day that the kids are best behaved. And I want to say to the teacher, and why do you think that is? It's not because the kids love practicing grapheme phoneme correspondences. It's because it's explicit, it's systematic, they have lots of opportunities to respond, they're completely engaged, right? And being engaged means I don't have time to do something I'm not supposed to be doing, right? So we also think about the practice that we're providing in different ways. So when we're talking about blocked practice, that means we introduce a skill, practice, practice, practice until we've mastered that skill before we move on to a new skill. And then we practice, practice, practice it until we've mastered it, and then we move on to another skill, okay? Another type of practice is called interleave practice, where I introduce a skill, but we just practice a little bit. Some kids master it, but most kids I know won't at that point. But I'm still going to go ahead and introduce another skill. They're going to get a little bit of practice with that before I introduce another one. And I'm going to keep doing that where we keep coming back to those previously taught skills and get practice. But it's distributed over time rather than all massed or blocked together. It's also interleaved with other skills. The idea behind that is that kids are able to kind of compare and contrast what is and isn't. So they're learning, the CK and then the SH and then the CH and having to kind of tell which one is which. And that helps them both learn it better and more importantly, retain it better. A perfect example of block practice is kind of the traditional way we do spelling tests, right? Give kids a list of words at the beginning of the week, have them practice it all week, write it in alphabetical order, write words 3 times each, blah, blah, blah. We test them on Friday, they get 100%, and we move on. When we know, deep down, that if we came back 4, 5, 6 weeks later and assessed them on that same list of words, most of the kids who got 100% are now going to get 40, 50, 60% at best because they don't retain them. We know that, but we keep doing it. We do it, I think, because parents really like getting a spelling list because it's the thing they know how to help their kids do. But we want to make sure that we're providing enough interleave practice with whatever we're teaching that it's going to stick. So effective instruction is explicit and systematic with ample opportunities to respond. But we have to make sure that they're responding correctly. We know that the old adage, practice makes perfect, right? But we also know that that's not true. Practice does not make perfect. What does practice make? I know some of you know this. Permanent. Practice makes permanent. Whatever we keep doing is what's going to stick. And so we need to make sure that whatever kids are practicing, they're practicing it the right way. So to do that, we're going to have to monitor them and provide feedback. And so they're really basically just 2 answers. It's right or it's wrong. If it's right, what we're going to do is provide behavior-specific praise. Okay? So behavior-specific praise is anything that you say, any verbal statement that's positive and encouraging and identifies to the student exactly what they did right. Okay? So it could be something behavioral, nice job following directions the first time, or it might be more focused on the academic skill. Great job saying the ooh in cool. Awesome work blending those letter sounds. Good thinking to try a different vowel sound in that word. Okay, I'm never just saying, nice job, great job, awesome work, good thinking. I'm saying good thinking doing what? Awesome work doing what? So they know exactly what they did well. So if they don't get it right, though, we have to provide corrective feedback. So I'm hoping this slide works because I just made this cool animation and I'm really proud of it. And I would be really sad if it doesn't work. Okay, so corrective feedback, anything that you say that is an immediate correction of an incorrect response, and it should always, always, always elicit the correct response. So it's not enough just to tell them they got it wrong, which really we don't ever do in corrective feedback. We never actually have to say, oops, wrong, right? The buzzer goes off, no, none of that, right? We can just kind of, let's look at this one again, right? So again, we're gonna do an I do, we do, you do. So model the correct response, guide all students in saying the correct response, and then ask students for a choral response. So, fingers crossed. All right. So let's say that I have on the board the word ship, and as I'm getting my students to read it, I hear one of them say, chip. Okay, so I'm not going to say, nope, who said chip? You're wrong. No, I'm not pointing at anybody out. I'm just going to model the correct response. We're going to all do it together, and then you're going to do it on your own. Okay, so I'm going to say, this grapheme is SH. Remember, we just learned this? Shh. What sound does it make? Shh. Okay, so watch me. Shh. P. Ship. Okay. I'm so happy. You have no idea. Okay, so now we're gonna all do it together. You ready? Ship, ship. Good job. Okay, now it's your turn without me. Ship. Okay, I gotta work on my timing, but good job. Okay. All right, so I'm so pleased that that worked. You have no idea. Okay, that is my new proud PowerPoint moment. You'll see a few others before we're done. Okay. All right, so in this, we have different kinds of corrective feedback, but it's all basically modeling the same way. So I do it, we do it, you do it. We're just going back and practicing it the right way one more time. We can think of corrective feedback on any skill that we're practicing, whether it's individual grapheme phoneme correspondences. Somebody sees that and they say, you know, oh, like A spells ah. Say it with me. A spells ah. Your turn. A spells ah. Okay, we can do it the same thing with a word. All right, so effective instruction, explicit, systematic, opportunities to respond, and good feedback, okay? So that's effective instruction. Effective intervention is all of the same things. That's what effective intervention is. There's only one thing that distinguishes intervention from instruction, and that is that intervention is also intensive. And by intensive, I mean that there are smaller groups, more targeted practice, and more time. Okay, that's how you increase intensity. But you're doing all of the same things that you were doing with your effective instruction. You're just doing it with fewer kids so that you can monitor their progress more carefully. You can be sure that they're responding. You can make sure that they understand the directions better. You're providing more opportunities to respond, and you're giving them more time to assimilate all of that. So when we talk about increasing intensity in Tier 1, of course, we're going to have I do, we do, you do, because that's effective instruction. But because we know how important opportunities to respond are, we're going to include a few more. And because I'm from the South, I'm going to add in a y'all do. All right, so I do it's me modeling it. We do is all of us doing it. Y'all do means I'm going to put you in pairs or in groups to practice. And then you do it means you're going to do it all by yourself independently. And in Tier 2, we just have more of all of those things. And in Tier 3, we have even more of these things. So it doesn't mean that we have to have a different program or a different set of instructions for kids to follow. In fact, we don't want to do that. I see very often situations where the kids who are struggling the most, those who are in Tier 3, they're getting one program for foundational skills in Tier 1, a different one in Tier 2, and a different one in Tier 3. That means they have 3 different scope and sequences to follow, 3 different ways of explaining the concepts. They're at different places and different programs. So the most vulnerable kids are also getting the most confusing combination of things thrown at them. Again, if your Tier 1 is not working, pick something else to do for Tier 1. And if your Tier 1 is good and it's meeting the needs of most of your students, just do more of that in smaller groups, more opportunities to respond for the kids who need it. When it comes to teaching foundational reading skills, the differences across the tiers needs to be quantitatively different, not qualitatively different. So the other aspect of intensive instruction, are you trying to get a picture of that?
I'll get it.
Okay. I can go backward too. Okay. The other thing that's important for intensive intervention is that it should be provided by the person with the most skills, right? The interventionist is the person that can do it, right? Does anybody remember Rick Lavoie in the Fat City workshops? Yeah, remember? I remember him telling the story about how going into classrooms and seeing little Johnny over here, who the teacher identified as the kid who's really struggling, and who's helping little Johnny but the volunteer grandma, or a paraprofessional that doesn't have a degree at all, or who an older kid, that's the one helping the child who's most struggling. And he said that's the equivalent of you going to the hospital with a really complicated medical problem and them saying, oh, let's call Louise from the flower shop to help you out. It makes no sense whatsoever. You would never accept that in any other context, but we do it to struggling readers all the time. So that's the other element of effective intervention. So effective intervention is all of these things, the same things in instruction, but we've also added in the characteristic of it being more intensive. So when we're thinking about effective intervention, we can say that most experts agree it should be explicit, it should be systematic, and it should be intensive. There's one other feature of effective reading intervention that experts don't agree on as readily, and that's whether or not it should be multisensory. And what does multisensory actually mean? And so I want to talk to you about how I define multisensory in the context of foundational reading skills. Okay, my thing is not clicking very well, so I'm going to just click. Okay, so the idea behind multisensory instruction is that it is coordinating multiple sensory pathways with the intention of enhancing memory and learning, right? And so we normally think of this as visual skills, auditory, kinesthetic, and tactile. So you're using multiple sensory pathways. Sometimes that's referred to as VAKT. The idea behind this is that you're consistently making connections between symbols, sounds, and movements. The problem is there's not a whole lot of research to support the traditional ways of doing multisensory instruction. So that part can be problematic. The traditional way is, now these are terms that I just kind of made up, but I think it helps to understand it. I categorize multisensory instruction into two main categories. And most of the traditional methods can be categorized as macro level. So macro level techniques are ones that use large movements, usually larger muscles, in order to provide that multisensory input. So things like saying a sound, looking at the letters and tracing it, skywriting. These are typical things usually associated with Orton-Gillingham approaches. And there's nothing really harmful about them. There's just no research to say that they're helpful. And there's a lot of assumptions made about them being helpful when the research doesn't bear that out. Now, the opposite of that, that's still multisensory, I think of as micro level. And these are ones that use smaller movements of smaller muscles, the muscles in your mouth. And the idea here is that you're doing things like saying a sound and watching the mouth in a mirror and attending to what your mouth is doing. Distinguishing among sounds based on their mouth movements. So for example, we'll see kids, as their articulation is developing, they'll substitute things. A really common one is, kids will say, I had to take a bath, right? The sounds and sound almost identical. The auditory input of those two things is really hard to distinguish. But what your mouth is doing when you're creating those two different sounds is different. So it's really no surprise when kids spell bath, B-A-F, right? Why wouldn't you? But if they're learning how to produce the sound and what's going on in their mouth, it alters how they perceive the sound. And there is research to support attention to articulatory gestures. So when you look at these mouths, can you tell what sounds are being produced? What about the first one? Could be What else could it be? P. Good. Or B. Those are only three sounds we make with our lips together like that. The sounds we associate with the letters M, P, and B. What about the middle one? That could be actually a lot of different ones. It could be T or D. or n, or l. There's lots of sounds that use that ridge behind your top teeth, the alveolar ridge. What about this one over here? Or v. The sound that we associate with F and V are the only sounds that we make like that. Now, consonants are pretty easy. Consonants, by definition, are sounds that are produced by stopping the airflow in some way, providing some turbulence in the airflow by connecting two parts of your mouth. Vowels are a little bit more tricky, okay? Vowels are a little bit harder to tell apart. Also, the vast majority of differences in accents are contained in the vowels, the way we pronounce vowels. I'm sure you're already thinking I say some things differently from how you say them, right? So the one on the left, what would we? Oh, yeah, probably an eh or maybe an e, right? The middle one could be ah or it could be aw. And this one could be oo or okay? It's not quite as for sure. But the idea here is that you already know something. Knowing something about articulatory gestures is somehow valuable to you. You are able to do that. And if we teach kids to attend to that, it can be really helpful to them. So instead of thinking about multisensory this way, my suggestion is to think of it as this, that the kinesthetic and tactile are the movements that are happening in your vocal tract while you're producing sounds. So there's one of the things that I have listed on the digital handout that I mentioned is a little blog that I wrote related to this to explain it a little bit more in depth. All right, so going back and thinking, we have to think about how to make sure we are providing effective instruction so that our tier 1 is solid. So now we're going to shift to the what. And I like to think of this as a road, the road to fluent reading. And the idea here is that when children enter school, they come with some knowledge of spoken language, some knowledge of written language. And we're going to build on that. Okay, so some kids come to school knowing something, and how much it varies based on the individual child and the home environment. But they'll usually know something about sounds and something about letters. And we're going to build on that knowledge. So as soon as kids enter school, that's where that road merges, the two roads merge. And we're going to start working on the connection between sounds and letters, or the connections between graphemes and phonemes. So we're going to call them grapheme-phoneme correspondences, but because that's a really long word that won't fit on my graphic here, we're going to refer to them as GPCs, okay? And as soon as kids know even just a couple of GPCs, they can start to read words. If I know that the letter A can represent the sound ah, and the letter T can represent the sound t, I can combine those and get the word at. And when I learn the letter S represents the sound s, I can spell sat and I can read sat. And then I can learn M and learn mat. I can learn P and learn pat, right? So I don't have to have all of my letters mastered before I start reading words. In fact, why would I want to do all that work learning letters if I don't understand that they can help me read words? So as soon as possible, we want kids reading words. And as soon as they've got a couple of words, they can start reading connected text. So if you can read the word pat and sat, you can read the sentence, Pat sat. Not a whole lot of substance there, but it's a sentence that holds meaning. You can draw a picture that shows that Pat sat. So I can start reading text from a very, very early point in my reading development. And that's something that we encourage. So I know that a lot of teachers, when I'm explaining this, they'll say, but I've always taught all the letters and sounds before we get into reading words. And that's kind of like, I don't know, going to basketball practice and having to just spend the entire time dribbling and never getting to shoot the ball or never getting to play a game. So what if you're bad at the game? You get to play it. That's what's motivating. That's why it matters that you get good at dribbling or get good at shooting, so that you can play the game. And we want kids to be able to play the game of reading, right? So we want to get them into it as soon as possible so that they understand why they're putting all that work in. So at each of these stages along the way, with grapheme, phoneme correspondences, words, and text, we want to develop kids' accuracy and their automaticity. It's not enough just to be accurate. We want them to be also automatic. So automaticity is something that you'll hear me talk about a lot through the rest of this. Automaticity we can think of as, I think of it as effortlessness, right? That we want to get kids to the point where whatever skill they're performing is something that they don't have to think about anymore. So think about skills that you've learned to that point. If you've learned to drive a car, if you've learned to play an instrument, if you've learned to play a sport, you practice and you practice and you practice till you don't have to think about what you're doing anymore. So my guess is most, if not everybody in the room has learned to drive a car. Maybe not an instrument or a sport, but you've probably learned to drive a car. And when you were first learning to drive a car, you probably had to put a lot of thought into things like, which of those things on the floor is the thing that I push on to go, and which is the one that I push to stop? Those are really important distinctions, and you really probably, you had to go to the far end of the mall parking lot when it was closed, right? And drive around so that you couldn't hurt anybody. And you did that, and you stopped and you started, and you stopped and you started until you got good at that. And you started connecting all of these skills. How to turn your blinker on, but you had to think about it consciously at first. And now, if you're like me, do you ever just get someplace and go, how the hell did I get here? I don't recall the journey at all because I was talking on the phone or I was listening to the radio and jamming along, right? Because you don't have to think about it once you get automatic with it. You don't have, when was the last time you thought which one of those pedals is the brake and which one is the gas? No, you don't have to think about it at all. You just do it. And that's what we want kids to get to that point of with reading, with decoding words. We want them to be so automatic they don't have to think about it. Their brain just does it for them. So the idea here is that when kids are less fluent, they have less automaticity, decoding takes up all of their cognitive load, all of their working memory, and they don't have anything left over to be able to comprehend what they're reading. In contrast, once they get really automatic, decoding just takes up a little bit of their cognitive effort. And they've got all of the rest left over to devote to understanding what they're reading. So I've actually heard people say, oh, you don't want to spend that much time on phonics. It takes away from meaning. Like it's actually the exact opposite. If we get kids really good at reading words, then they don't ever have to think about it again. They just can do it. And that's what we want for kids. We want to get them to the point of automaticity with word reading. All right, so we're just going to kind of go down the road, and we're going to talk a little bit about GPCs, a little bit about words, and a little bit about text. All right, so we're going to talk about sounds and letters first. Sorry. Okay, so these are the things that kids are coming in with, right? So when we're talking about sounds, we're talking about phonemes, right? And this is the educator's definition of a phoneme. A phoneme is the smallest unit of sound in spoken language. Everybody heard that definition or something really close to it before? Okay, so this definition is accurate, but it's incomplete. Okay? A phoneme is the smallest unit of sound, but it is also the physical act used to produce that sound. We refer to that as the vocal gesture or the articulatory gesture. So Isabel Lieberman was one of the very first researchers who made the connection between phonemic awareness and reading skill. And from the very beginning, if you go back and read her articles from the 60s and the 70s, she refers to phonemes as vocal gestures or articulatory gestures. And somewhere along the way, that just got lost. And we focused just on the sound part. We stopped focusing on what's happening in your mouth. But it's really what the phoneme is. That is the definition of a phoneme. So that means being phonemically aware means you have to be aware of both the sound and the associated mouth movement. You're not really phonemically aware if you don't understand what's going on in your mouth. And if you think about kids that you've taught who struggled with reading, a lot of them will also make articulation errors. They're capable of making the sounds correctly, but they will mispronounce a word, usually substituting another word. My nephew, who is dyslexic, when he was a little guy, 5, 6 years old, he was playing soccer, and he got really mad because he kicked the ball out of balance, right? And do you mean out of bounds? He goes, yeah, out of balance, right? Those two, he wasn't aware of the differences in the pronunciation of those two words. So being aware of how you're pronouncing sounds matters a lot when you're spelling. So you were asking before about kids who can read words but struggle with spelling. A lot of times they're just not really fully aware of which sound they're producing, because spelling words requires the capacity to segment the phonemes, and you can't segment phonemes you're not aware of or not pronouncing correctly. So understanding what your mouth is doing is an important element there. This came also from the National Reading Panel report. Somewhere along the line in our early professional learning activities related to phonemic awareness, somebody made the analogy that you can do phonemic awareness instruction with your eyes closed, or you could do it in the dark. Have you guys heard that? Okay, so that somehow got people believing that it wasn't phonemic awareness if you had letters, right? But even as far back as the National Reading Panel report said, that teachers need to recognize that acquiring phonemic awareness is a means rather than an end. PA is not acquired for its own sake, but rather for its value in helping learners understand the alphabetic system to read and write. It's why it's important to include letters when teaching children to manipulate phonemes, and why it's important to be explicit about how children are to use the PA skills in reading and writing tasks. We want to connect the manipulation of phonemes to print. So I'll get, well, then it's not phonemic awareness, it's phonics. Well, guess what? It can be both. If you think about developing that capacity to manipulate the sounds in spoken language, any instruction that helps you get better at that is phonemic awareness instruction. If you're using letters, yes, it's also phonics instruction, but you're doing both things at the same time, and it makes both more effective. So one of the resources that I have linked on our digital handout is a video that is just about pronouncing sounds in a blendable way. When we're pronouncing sounds for reading instruction, we need to be careful about how we're pronouncing the sounds, that we're not doing ba and ga kind of sounds, because those can't be blended. Those are the obvious ones I hear a lot, that teachers are pretty aware of clipping sounds off and saying b, not ba, and g, not ga. But there are a lot of other sounds that I think, because our first grade teachers lied to us way back when, and they taught us the sounds made a different, letters that represented different sounds than we know that they do. They're really ingrained. So one of them is W. If you're like me, your first grade teacher taught you that W says wah. You can clip that and say wah. It's still not the sound that you hear in the word. If I'm saying the word wish, I don't say wah-ish. I say wish. Listen to that first sound. That's very different than wah, right? It's much easier to blend though. Wish, wet, winter. And it's cold here, by the way. I'm sorry, but that just got me thinking about how freaking cold it is okay. I'm heading back to Florida tonight, and I'm good with that, okay. So anyway, so this video is just yours truly modeling just the letters of the alphabet, how to pronounce each one. So W is a tricky one, Y is another tricky one. Did your first grade teacher teach you that Y says yeah? You don't say yeah, L-O, yeah, ear, right? You say yellow, year, yes. It's a different sound, and if we teach those sounds from the beginning, kids can blend them from the beginning. All right, letters. When you say that a child knows his letters, there are really a lot of different ways you can know your letters. You can, for example, know letter names. Okay, so I can say, what letter is this? You can tell me that's an A. Or I can give you a bunch of letters and ask you which one of these is A. Those are two completely different skills. The second one is actually a lot easier than the first one. It's much easier to recognize that as an A than to have to generate the name of the letter. But I can also ask you, for example, what sound does this letter make? Do you know that it makes the sound A? Do you also know that A can represent the sound A or A or Okay. I can also ask you, can you write the letter A? Do you know where to begin, which direction to move, and where to end up? That's all part of knowing the letter A. And can you name letters quickly? Do you have letter naming automaticity? Okay, so rapid letter naming is another element of knowing your letters. So just be careful when you say that. A child knows his letter, doesn't know his letter. Well, what do they know or what do they not know? So moving along down the road, now we're ready to move on to GPCs, or grapheme phoneme correspondences. So first, let's just talk about what graphemes and phonemes are. In a word like sheep, I have 3 sounds, sh, e, and p. In the word sheep, I've got 3 graphemes. I have sh that represents sh. I have ee that represents the e sound, and I've got a p that represents p. The number of letters is completely unpredictable because a grapheme can be 1, 2, 3, or 4 letters. We've got 26 letters, but we have somewhere between 300 and 400 graphemes in English. And the only reason we don't know is because we can't agree on which words are English words. But you'll notice that phonemes and graphemes, there's always the same number because a grapheme is a written representation of a phoneme. So we talked about how to introduce a grapheme very explicitly, right? This is introducing that grapheme phoneme correspondence very explicitly. We can build automaticity once we've developed accuracy. We can develop automaticity by doing drills. One kind of drill is a visual drill, where I'll show one grapheme at a time, and you can tell me what that represents. You can say CK is K, Y is Y, E is eh, or maybe if you've learned E is eh and E, you can tell me all of those, right? And so it's just a very quick way to build and practice grapheme phoneme correspondences using a visual drill. You can also do an auditory drill. In an auditory drill, you present the phoneme and your students produce the grapheme. So you are saying ah, and they write the letter and say ah is A. Okay? They might also, let's say you did Z. They could say that Z is Z and Z is S, because both of those are common ways to spell Z. Okay, so for both of these, it's important that you're both modeling blendable sounds and expecting blendable sounds from your students. That's a key part of that, is that the pronunciation of sounds is a sound that we can use when we're reading words. For kids who are struggling, helping them attend to their articulatory gestures can support them getting better. So words. This is the one that's most important, right? Is getting into being able to read and spell words. So to think about this, it's important to understand how word reading develops. And nobody has done more in this area than Linnea Airy. You guys heard of Linnea Airy? Right. So Airy has a theory about the phases of word recognition development. And she very carefully uses the word phase, not stage. The way that she talks about it is that phases can overlap, whereas a stage, she thinks of that as having a beginning and an end. And we see kids exhibiting behaviors from 2 phases at the same time, all the time. So it's important to think of it in terms of that idea of phases. So I'm just going to take you really quickly through 5 phases. Normally, in most of the writings that Airy has done about The phases, she talks about 4 of them, but there is a 5th one that she has written about a few times. You'll learn about that one too. So the first phase is the pre-alphabetic phase. And in the pre-alphabetic phase, this is when kids start to see things in their environment and they associate them with words, right? But the things that they're noticing are not the actual letters. When you're driving down the street and your 4-year-old says, "Oh, can we stop at McDonald's?" And you say, "Oh, he can read." Can he really read? Is he reading the word McDonald's there, or is he seeing the golden arches and knows that the Happy Meal is in his future, right? He's not reading that, but when he says he wants a Coke. So at this point in their development, kids are attending to visual cues and associating them with words, but it's not attending to letters, right? And at this point, kids also start to attend to irrelevant visual cues. There was one study that I just think is fascinating, and I've heard different versions of how this went down, but the idea here is that little kids, like 3 years old, were being taught to read a series of like 7 or 8 consonant vowel consonant words. And it was some experiment to see how many trials it took them or something. That's not important. What's important is that the researchers noticed that all of the kids started getting one of the words right, but still struggling with the other ones, and they couldn't figure out what was easier about that one word until somebody noticed that that word, that card that had that word on it, also had a thumbprint in the corner. And so the kids apparently were looking at the thumbprint and saying that word. And so to test this, they replicated the thumbprint on a different word card. And all of the kids said the first word with the second thumbprint card. So they tested it again with a blank card with the thumbprint, and half the kids still said the first word with the blank card. So like, they were not paying any attention to the word itself. They noticed that they got it right if they said that word when the thumbprint card came along. So in Aries pre-alphabetic phase, kids will rely on whatever they know, right? Humans have a tendency to seek out the path of least resistance, right? So if we allow kids or even encourage kids to do things like guessing based on the picture, they're going to always do that and not even attempt to look at the letters, right? All right, so the next phase that kids move into is the partial alphabetic phase. This is when they start to notice things and overgeneralize. So usually they'll attend to the initial grapheme or the final one, but very seldom the ones in the middle. So at one point, this child saw a word that began with P, and in that case, the word was puppy. And now every time they see a word that begins with P, oh, that's puppy, and they're very confident about that. Okay, so that's still not really reading. They're starting to notice that letters can be helpful, but they're not really doing it yet until they get to the full alphabetic phase. In the full alphabetic phase, they can look at all of the letters in a word, associate sounds with each letter, and they can get to the word. They can say k, at, cat. That's decoding. This is real reading. This is when they finally are actually reading the words. It's letter by letter decoding. It might be slow and laborious, but it's accurate. When they can get accurate at this point, they're in the full alphabetic phase. But we don't want them to stay there. We want them to get automatic, but we also, part of becoming automatic is noticing patterns and using letter patterns to figure out words. So for example, they may, in the consolidated alphabetic phase, connect graphemes together and notice in a word like splash, they might notice the pattern of SPL and the pattern of ASH to get to the word. So it's not letter by letter. They're not necessarily saying splash. They just notice these connected graphemes and say the word very quickly. So this is a more mature form of reading. Yes?
So if I have a few intervention students who are stuck in that full alphabetic phase and they're still trying to make every grapheme sound, you know, we're working on sounding out words like splash.
Mm-hmm.
Recommend lessons on reading the blends or reading the rhyme or beyond
Yeah, so one of the things that we used to think was that it was a good idea to do that earlier on, like teach word families when kids were first learning. One of the first things they learned before they even know all their letters, they learn the at family. But now we know that's not how word reading develops. Learning the chunks happens after they've learned the individual. So yeah, you want to start pointing out these are connected words. A good way to do that is helping them with word chains, where you're keeping a part of the word intact and they're just changing a little part, so they're not having to identify all of it over and over again. They're just learning how to blend using a different initial phoneme or a different final phoneme. All right, so beyond the consolidated alphabetic phase is one more phase, and again, ARI doesn't always include this because it really doesn't pertain to children. It's really more of an adult phase, and that is the automatic phase. So we're going to test you right now to see if you're at the automatic phase. How you feeling? Pretty confident? All right, I'm going to put words on the screen, and I want to see if you can read it. You can do this silently. You don't have to read aloud. But read it along and see if you can keep up with the words as they're coming up. Okay, are you ready? Everybody looking at the screen? Here goes. Done? Yeah. Yay, you're at the automatic phase. You are proficient adult readers. Okay, so that's good news, first of all. Thank goodness. But this is the point where we want our kids to eventually get to, and we have to get them developing through the other phases to get them to this point, to become proficient, to become automatic. This is what we want to see. All right, so you know what? I don't think I put this on the digital handout, but I will, because this kind of addresses the question you just answered, or just asked. It answers the question you just asked. This has the 4 main phases, and instruction that you can do along with each phase. And the important thing to note is the instruction during a phase is not just to help you get really good at that phase, it's to move you on. We always want to be pushing kids into the next phase. So when they're in the full alphabetic phase, it says focus on segmenting and blending phonemes and on getting children to attend to every grapheme individually first. Then focus on the recognition of the various chunks within words, ample practice reading words and connected text. Lots of practice so they get better at it and can move into the consolidated phase. But I will add this little chart too to the digital handout. All right, so it's important also to think about when we're talking about decoding and encoding. How am I doing on time? 5 minutes? Oh my gosh. Okay, I really do talk. Okay, I'm gonna talk really, really fast. Don't ask any more questions. Okay. Okay, according to Linnea Airy, learning to read and learning to spell are one and the same almost. She also talks about them being 2 sides of a coin. We want to learn encoding and decoding. Both are really important. So you're going to get a really, really fast version of this. Decoding, we're talking about translating print into speech, and that requires the capacity to blend phonemes. Encoding is translating speech into print, and that requires the capacity to segment phonemes. All right, all of this is to lead to a mental process we call orthographic mapping, and this is where you're connecting these graphemes and phonemes together quickly enough and automatically enough that it's as though you're reading the words instantly on sight, okay? That instant recognition and retrieval, we're also connecting the pronunciation and the meanings here. So for a word like frog, if I want to encode the word, I'm going to think of the spoken word frog, I'm going to think of the phonemes in that word, and I'm going to think of how to represent those with graphemes. If I'm going to decode, I'm going to look at the word and think of each phoneme and then blend those together to get the spoken word. That process works even when the words we're using don't have a one-to-one letter sound correspondence if we've got multi-letter graphemes like the SH in fish. Also works when we have irregular words. We can sound out most of a word like said with exactly the grapheme phoneme correspondences we would expect. We just have to remember that one of those has a different sound to them than what we're expecting. So to teach these, I'm going to talk about 2 main methods, Elkonin boxes. This was a method developed by an actual human named Elkonin. This is Elkonin. And I say that because I've heard his name mispronounced so many ways. It's not Elkonian, it's not Elkin, it's not Conan boxes, right? All right, so he described a method for teaching children to segment the sounds in words by giving them a picture and having them move markers into the boxes to say k, e, k, at, og, okay? That was great. That helped kids develop phonemic awareness, or in particular, phoneme segmentation skills. Later on, researchers started adding letters to this. So instead of just doing this with markers, you would fill in the letters as you figured this out. This made the practice much more effective. Including letters helps kids develop their understanding of the alphabetic principle, their decoding skills, and develops their orthographic mapping. So we want to do that. In order to do that, there's a process that I like to go through with kids, especially if I'm doing intervention. I'll start by counting the sounds in the word with the child. I'll say f, I, sh. Next, I will draw one box for each sound. This is another proud PowerPoint moment. Okay, draw one box for each sound. F, I, sh. Okay. Whoa. I know. Then I'm going to move markers in and say f-ish. I can pull them back out. F-ish. And then I'm going to insert the grapheme, a letter or letter combination for each word, for each sound. Then I'm going to write the whole word. I want the kids to see what the word looks like without the boxes around the word. And then finally, we're going to read the whole word. Okay, so that process really helps. Another, I'm not going to do that. Let's keep going. There's a handout that talks about all this attached to the digital handout. And you have to stick around so that I can get to the QR code with that. Okay, another practice that's really powerful is using manipulative letters. So we use manipulatives in math all the time, right? To make abstract concepts more concrete for kids. Same thing. In reading, we can make these abstract concepts of phoneme segmentation and blending more concrete for kids if we're using letters. So we can use all types of letters. One of the things that I strongly recommend is using letters of all the same color. Using multicolored letters or using like one color consonant, one color vowels is very popular, but there's really no research to support it. And for kids who are in the pre and partial alphabetic phase, we don't want them to learn color as a part of a letter's identity. The only feature of a letter that's important is the letter shape. And that's what we need to focus on. So there are letters out there that are the same color, and we recommend that. All right, to do this, using a word chain, I can have kids spell a word. It's another proud PowerPoint moment. And then I can change things and say, what would I need to do to change sip to lip? I would take off the S and put in its place an L. What word? Lip. And then I can say, let's put an F there. What word do I have now? Flip. And how would I change flip to flop? Take out the I, replace it with an O. And if I change the O to an A, what word would that be? Flap. And how would I change flap to flag? Okay, so I'm practicing both encoding and decoding these words, right? Handout in there for that purpose as well. And there's also a video about using word chains to support encoding and decoding practice at different levels of difficulty. But the idea here is you want to do both encoding and decoding to ensure that kids are learning what they need to learn. Okay, I'm going to skip our fun stuff about connected text so that I can get to the end where I can show you. Wow, I really talked way too long at the first part. Okay, here is the QR code that I promised. And there's stuff on there you're going to wonder, what wonderful things was she going to say about this topic that's on my handout, but not that I didn't get to hear about. But hopefully this is helpful. If you have any questions, I know the time is up and you probably have another session to run to, but if you have questions, I'm happy to stick around and answer them.
Let's give Dr. Lane a round of applause. It was absolutely wonderful.